You're listening to the Integrative Health Simplified podcast with Kari, Coody, pharmacist turned integrative health practitioner. Here we talk all things straightforward and honest when it comes to holistic health and simplifying your best steps forward while eliminating all the gimmicks and confusion. Leave the overwhelm at the door and get ready for impactful action steps that get to the real root of your issue and actually move the needle in your health. Let's dive into the show. Hello there, and welcome back into the Integrative Health Simplified podcast. My name is Kari. I'm your host, and I'm excited to dive into a brand new series that we have titled Women's Health, Fact or Fiction. I wanted to do this particular series because I know that, first of all, the integrative health world is complicated, can be at times anyway, and that's what the whole podcast exists for. However, just kind of narrowing it down to the topic of being a woman and trying to figure out, like, you hear all these things like what is true and what's not. And especially just thinking about how things change as we get older and what we should be focusing on and why, those types of things. That's kind of what I want to talk about in this series. So I wanted to start it out with the simple differences between men and women, because that is why I have the first few episodes in place and why they do make a really big difference when we're talking about women making these simple swaps for your regular routine. That's what the very first series I did talked about. That's why they make such a big difference. That's why those swaps are there. And if you haven't listened to those first 8 episodes, that would be a great place to start. So if you have not listened to those, you can either listen to this or either pause it, head on over and just put those in your queue and listen to those episodes. And I think it's going to make a lot more sense when you hear what I'm going to chat about in today's episode about the differences between men and women and why all of those things that I spoke about make such a huge difference when you do swap those up in your daily routine. And so let's dive into the topic of how are men and women different, and why does that really even matter? So in the whole grand scheme of things, men and women have very different environmental and nutritional stressors, and the way that we use those things and the way that our body kind of responds to those things. And so let me kind of explain that a little bit better. So, just in thinking about how our bodies function within a period of time, let's say. So we know that as women, we have cycles, right? We have our menstrual cycle that determines a lot of things for us, right? I've talked about before how it's a really good health indicator, how your cycle is doing. That you even have one is really, really important. Our bodies are made to run off of that cycle. And so we're actually going to be talking more about that in an upcoming series that I have coming up later on this year in 2023. But because it's that important, I made a whole series out of it. So obviously, women have this cyclical cycle every 28 or so days, and that is really important for us. But you have to think about it. Men don't have that. Men actually have a 24-hour cycle, and it's kind of like ours is tied to the moon. Theirs is tied to the sun. And so their testosterone rises and peaks with the sun, and it declines toward the end of the day, and it just repeats the next day and again and again and again. And so you can see how men are a little bit more steady. Women are a little bit more, I don't want to use the word erratic like it's a bad thing, but we do have that 28-day cycle that can definitely have peaks and valleys, and, every day is not necessarily the same. And so that kind of matters when you think about how our body handles stress, how it handles what we throw at it, how it handles if we're fueling it properly. Those types of things really matter a lot more than you might think. So in just thinking about it as a whole, I know I talk a lot about stress because it is so important on our overall health, like how much stress we're having and how we're kind of dealing with that stress, because men are a lot more resilient to stress than women. Their physiology, as far as like having higher testosterone, lower estrogen, higher muscle mass, those types of things, all of that is very protective, and it allows them to really like fully embrace that more masculine side, right? They stay in that masculine energy per se a lot of the time. That's kind of what we think about when we think about men, right? Their masculine energy is sort of like an output energy. Their physiology is driven by how much they give out. It's action oriented. And like I said, their hormonal rhythm is more of like a 24-hour rhythm. It's tied to the sun, and there's peaks and valleys within a 24-hour period, but it's the same day after day. And so women are not necessarily like that, right? We utilize energy differently. Our body is more so geared toward abundance and safety. And because it's interesting how, if you think about that's sort of our output a lot of times, especially as moms, we are very nurturing. Not that we can't have masculine energy. Of course we can, like get things done and just things like you would think about boundaries and stability and focus and decisiveness and confidence. Like those are more masculine characteristics, and not that we can't or don't have those. However, I think that it's really interesting how our society it's kind of switched those roles a little bit, if you know what I mean. And I think a lot of times we as women feel like we need to stay in that masculine mentality a lot of times, when that's really not where we should stay in all the time. Maybe we go in and out of that, but as a whole, we're much more softer than that with feminine energy. And I'm saying all this to hopefully help you to understand that there is a difference between a man and a woman. And all those differences matter in how our body, really runs, and how we are in a month's time, how that shifts with women, and also how we are men are very much more resilient to stress than women. That is one fact that is not often talked about. And that's really why men can drop, they can cut calories and exercise and often lose weight pretty quickly. That's why, right? They utilize things differently. They respond to stressors differently. Not that they don't, of course they need nutrients and they need things to support their output. Remember, I talked about how they're really geared toward what they can output. This doesn't mean they're like superheroes. It just means they're less affected by stress because they have different hormonal balances, and they have different ways their body utilizes energy. And so I think that's really important to consider why stress affects us so much more, and why that is often the key to women experiencing a lot of symptoms or not, having painful cycles every month or not, having the energy they need or not, because the stressors that we often internalize. If you think about that, women often internalize things way more than men do. Not that they don't internalize some things, but us as women, we can be standing still and we have a million thoughts going on in our head, and men just aren't typically like that. And so because of all those reasons, over-exercising, under-eating, skipping breakfast, things like intermittent fasting, they affect us so much more than men because of all those reasons that I stated. And so I think just thinking about this topic in the way of women's health, fact or fiction, like that's the reason why all those things that I mentioned in those first 8 episodes matter so much. And those are sort of like foundational, because if our body doesn't have what it needs in terms of energy, in terms of, even minerals to run on, to spark enzymatic processes in our body, like that's really where everything starts. Your body is going to be pulling from empty, and that can have a pretty bad ripple effect over time. Because again, these things don't happen over a few days. This happens over weeks, months, and years. And so our body is very resilient. It is, but over time, it really starts to wave the white flag. Like, I don't have what I need. I'm starting to show you in these different symptoms. And I think oftentimes, if we haven't been giving it what it needs, and if we have really been not treating it like we need to, a lot of times that 30, 35, 40, no, that was a long time span, but somewhere in those years, you're going to start to tell. Right? We're going to start to get symptoms. And I'm going to be talking in some of the episodes to follow in this series of women's health in what's actually real and what's actually fiction, right? What actually does happen as we age, but what is not necessarily part of the normal aging process is actually part of what's been happening the last few years that's just catching up with you. So we're going to be talking about some of those things in the next few episodes. So if you're around that 35, 40 age range and you've just heard this a lot of, we're actually going to be talking about it more specifically in the very next episode, but I know you've heard like everything goes downhill after 35. We're going to be digging in this topic because as a 40-year-old, I get it. I've heard it. And so I want to kind of help you to understand what's normal, what is a normal process of aging, what you should be, expecting over the next few years and what's not, because I think that's really important when we think about really just having things that happen and we just think they're normal, but they're really not. They're common, but they're not normal. So that's kind of what I want to differentiate. I hope you stick around for the next few episodes because I'm really excited about them. I love digging into women's health. I think it's an important topic to just make sure that we understand from a physiological standpoint what's going on, to understand that. And so then we understand why it's so important to do these things to help support our body, right? I think we really are a lot more apt to buy into that if we understand the reasoning behind it. And so hopefully I can explain these things in a simplified way. Obviously, that's what I like to do, is just kind of break down maybe these complicated topics into more simple ways that you can take action on these things. That's what I love to do. So I hope you are just enjoying this podcast. I have had this podcast for about 4 months now. So if you haven't listened to some of the past episodes, I would encourage you to do that. I'm just really excited about this series and I can't wait to kick it off, you guys. See you on the next episode. If this episode has served you in any way, I would love it if you'd share any aha moments or takeaways over on Instagram and tag me at Kari Coody. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so we can continue to learn and grow together.